One of the most commonly asked questions I get on this channel is what exactly are my specific settings inside of Gran Turismo 7, and I think it's time I finally answered that. I'm going to show you my personal preferences for every single setting inside of Gran Turismo 7 for the ultimate settings guide. However, before we do get into this video, I'm trying to get this channel to 70,000 subscribers, so if you want to stay up to date with everything GT7 and motorsport gaming related, then feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and of course turn your notifications on. Anyway, let's get to it, starting off with a disclaimer. Now the first is that there's going to be no specific wheel settings in this video. That's because each and every single wheel is entirely different. So for me personally, I run a T598. However, the settings that I have on that wheel may be entirely different from what you run on, let's say, a Logitech G29 if you're going for an entry wheel, or of course something like a Fanatec. So I have left them out from this video. However, I may do an entirely separate guide on my personal wheel settings a little later down the line. Now this is recorded on a PS5 Pro, so again my settings may be slightly different from what you see on a base PS5 or of course a PlayStation 4 Pro or PS4. Now of course the next point is these are my personal settings, so what I like you might not exactly like for absolutely everything. You might have your own personal preference for a specific setting, and that's absolutely fine. Again, this is just a basic guide of what exactly I'm running inside of Gran Turismo 7. And the final point is that I am running medium length stick extenders on the DualSense. So when it comes to the actual DualSense control settings, just bear in mind that I am running an add-on with the form of a Control Freak Galaxy medium length stick extender for my steering input. Anyway, that's it. Let's go over to the settings then. So let's kick things off then with the first of the global settings, and this is going to be display settings. Now there's a few things you need to remember here. It's going to also depend on what exact PlayStation you're running, so whether that's a PS4, PS4 Pro, PS5 or a PS5 Pro. Of course the next thing to take into account is what you are running for your display, whether that's a TV monitor and of course the actual capabilities of the display that you're using. However, here's what it looks like for me. So we'll look at exposure first. This is 0.0 EV. However, I do sometimes have it up as much as minus 0.6 EV. Again, this is completely up to you and it's going to be dependent on the display you're using. Saturation though, this is something that I don't change. I do have mine set at 100%. Of course, the less that you put it, the less saturated the image is going to be. But for me personally, I like it nice and bright and pretty saturated, so 100% for me. Next up is graphics priority for PlayStation 5 Pro. I believe this is the same for the base PS5, it just works a bit different. So I have prioritized frame rate and prioritize ray tracing / resolution. I believe ray tracing on a base PS5 is in the menus and replays only. Of course for the PS5 Pro it is across the board. Again, if I want graphics and it to be more cinematic and look better, I go for graphics. If I want to be fast, of course I'll choose frame rate. Next up is 120 Hz output. Now I believe on a base PS5, I don't know if they've sorted this, it's incredibly jaggy. However, for a PS5 Pro, if you do have a monitor or something like that that can handle it, it is 100% worth it. It isn't a jagged mess anymore and it looks a much cleaner image. So I would say if you want to be as fast as possible on a PS5 Pro, go for prioritized frame rate and have 120 Hz on. Of course, if you want to go for graphics, turn this off and of course set the graphics priority to actual graphics. So overall, again, if you want it to look good, have it like this. If you, of course, you want to be fast and you're on a PS5 Pro, prioritize your frame rate and go for 120 Hz. If you're on a base PS5 or a PS4, just go ahead and set it to frame rate only and don't include that, as again it's a jagged image. So next up we have 8K support, and I'm going to ignore that because I don't have an 8K capable monitor. And then we have one of the single best settings for a PS5 Pro, which is VR positional reprojection settings for the PlayStation 5 Pro. I fully recommend just having this on. The best thing about a PS5 Pro and PSVR 2 is Gran Turismo 7. honestly, that much clearer, more crisp image just looks incredible on a PSVR 2, and it's this single setting and the PS5 Pro that made me actually start using my VR much more than I previously did on a base PS5. Again, whilst the PS5 Pro update wasn't that good whatsoever, the best thing about it was definitely PSVR 2, which makes it an absolute game changer, and those on a PS5 Pro with PSVR 2 will know exactly what I'm on about. So I fully recommend having this setting set to on. Just a quick note here, I got my PS5 Pro prior to the actual PS5 Pro update for GT7, so I don't actually know what this menu looks like on a base PS5 anymore, but I'm pretty sure these are PlayStation 5 Pro only settings in terms of the bottom two. That's going to lead me into the next one. Using PSSR on a PlayStation 5 Pro, I do have this enabled if I'm running prioritizing the ray tracing and resolution. Of course, this is the PS5 Pro super resolution that they was making a whole deal about when advertising the console. Some people love it, some people hate it. For me personally, if I am prioritizing the graphics and such, then I do have it enabled. If I'm prioritizing the frame rate again and I want to be as quick as possible, I do have it disabled. So again, it's just worth bearing in mind that depending on what you are specifically doing inside of GT7 will probably depend if you have that on or off. Of course, last off, we do have display settings, which basically just takes you through it with a bit of a handheld guide to make your image look better. It mainly comes up with this. As you can see, you've got your exposure, which you can turn up and down. Again, just kind of do that to how you want your image to look. And of course, the next one we have is saturation, which is, you know, the amount of color and such in the image and how saturated you want it. My main settings there, again, you can see it works for me is minus 0.6 and 100%, resolution 4K, HDR on, and of course prioritize ray tracing and resolution, especially if I'm recording videos and such. So next up then, we have sound volume. Of course, this is going to be the volume you have in game. For me, I have it set on enhanced sound, but there is multiple options between background music and sound and race background music focus. For me, the enhanced sound all the way. I've just never ever changed this setting. Of course, because I record videos, I have my background music set to off, menu sound effects 10, background music in the race off, as well as the actual race background music completely off. Race sound effects, I have this boosted up to 10, which I believe is the maximum. I like it to be as loud as possible here in the cars, transmissions and such. And of course, we do have some specific settings for that. As for replay background music, of course, again, off completely, and replay sound effects, which again is going to be the sort of car noise and such, again set to 10 maximum. I want it as loud as possible. As for music replay volume balance, I have sound effects only. Of course, you can switch it all the way to background music only, or of course right in the middle where it'll balance the background music and the sound effects. But again, I do not have the sound track to this game actually set to on. Music replay master volume, once again I want it as loud as possible because I only have sound effects, so again 10 for this one. And then of course the setting below that is other background music, which of course I'm going to have to 0 and off. And then we get into the more specific ones. Player engine noise is of course the sound of your car. By default, I believe this is set at 0. You can turn it down to -5. I have mine at +5 for as loud as possible. Same with transmission. I love a transmission whine, so anywhere from 2.5 to +5 will do for me. Tire squeals, again, it can be a little bit overbearing, so I have this at +2.5. Rival cars engine noise, once again at +5. Again, I like to hear them as loud as possible as I'm going past a rotary Mazda RX-7 or something like that. And of course I do have broadcast mode on, but again I have all of the music already off, so completely irrelevant, that one. Now next up is race difficulty. Of course this is dependent on how difficult you want your race to be. For me, I always run the game on hard because it's just not very difficult and the AI is not very good, but it will change depending on what I'm doing. Some of the grinding events in GT7 I will have the AI set to easy. That is mainly Le Mans and also I believe Sardinia. As for the rest of the time, I will actually just have the game running at hard difficulty in the background and I'll never really change it. Again, whilst this doesn't actually increase any payout or anything like that, it does actually set the difficulty of the AI to a reasonable enough pace that they can actually be, you know, rather rather difficult. Now next up is demo. This might sound strange, but this is what happens when you leave your game and you just let it run in the background. It will switch a demo on. So you have the option for auto demo playback. I set mine to on. Of course you can turn it off if you want to, and this just makes sure that there's no such thing as screen burning or a ghosting image as such. Again, it just kind of stops it being stuck on a single menu if I just happen to walk away for a good amount of time. Of course you can also set the time until playback. I just leave mine at the default of 60 seconds. Next up is opening movie. Of course this is if you want the opening movie to play. Typically I'll have this off, so I don't know why I've got it set to on, and basically it will load the game up without you having to actually see the movie load up for the 1000th time. So let's move on to the next setting. That's going to be units. It's going to be very much dependent on where you're from, whether you use miles or kilometers. I'm from the UK, so of course I'm going to use miles. In-game notifications, this is I believe when the music pops up, but because I have it off it never actually appears. You can have now playing on or off. Then we have network, which is delete temporary data from the console's storage. Again, you can just go ahead and delete that if you want. I don't actually know what it does, but again, I just ignore that one all the time. The one that I do keep an eye on is storage availability. This is of course your saved replays, escapes and race photos and such, and again you have a maximum of 100% to use. Mine is currently at 37.2. If you press edit on each of these, it will just take you into them individually, and you can delete off replays, photos and such that you don't want anymore. Of course then we have text settings, which really is just, you know, different text settings that are in the game. Again, I leave that completely default. And then of course we have chat function, which you can have on or off, which will mute messages from other users and such. Next up is controller settings, and first up we're going to head into vibration. Now the main one we're looking for is going to be the actual P1 settings, because of course if you're using a controller, most of the time you're going to be playing on your own. So vibration function for player 1, I have this set to on. Some people have it off, but for me personally I like the feedback. Then of course we have vibration strength, which I have at 100%. Again, if you want vibration on but not as, I guess, heavy, then just turn this down. Again, there's probably people out there that actually mess around with this setting, but I think if you're going to have vibration on, have it set at 100% so you get the feedback. Of course, if you don't have it on, just turn it off. Now next up is some very important ones when it comes to a controller, and that is going to be trigger effects. Now of course this is part of the haptic feedback and all that stuff, and if you played any other racing game that doesn't feature haptic feedback on a PS5, it is absolutely the strangest feeling after going from something like GT7. So for me, when it comes to accelerator, I always have this on strong. It gives you a nice feedback that you're not just going to plant all the power down and then spin out. The one that can be changed really is going to be brake. Sometimes I will actually run it on weak depending on the car that I'm going to use. Most of the time I will have it on strong, so I've got, you know, all of the feeling that's going to be there through that trigger if I'm using a controller. But again, sometimes I may turn it to weak. I do know some people that actually run it completely off. So typically strong, sometimes strong, weak. Now the final setting I'm going to look at here is PlayStation VR 2 headset vibration. Now as you can see, you got multiple choices here: on for collisions and impacts, or on for collisions only, or completely off. Again, I just like the feeling when I've got the VR headset on and I have a crash, so for me personally I keep this on the main setting, which is collisions and impacts. Of course next up we do have wireless controller P1, and I have a couple of button settings that I'd fully recommend changing, and that's actually going to be nitrous and overtake and the camera. Now I believe by default inside of Gran Turismo 7 the actual kind of nitrous and overtake button is set to the right stick, in which you will need to click down. But you'll probably know that is incredibly awkward, as I believe the camera is also there as well. So a lot of the time when you click the stick down, it would stop moving the camera about, and it was just incredibly annoying to actually use, especially if you're driving something like a super formula. So the thing I did was many years ago was just directly flip those buttons. So now instead of having look back on L1, I have my nitrous and overtake, and if I want to look back at the cars behind me, I'll have it set to the right stick R3 button, which of course you will need to click in. I feel like this is just the better way to have it set out. Although it's only a slight change, I do feel overall it's an absolute game changer. So of course I've skipped over specific wheel settings. That's going to be completely different depending on your wheel. next up is profile, and the first is profile photo. So from any of the images that you've actually shared, you can go ahead and use that as your profile photo. It's what people will see when they view your profile in game. Same with the cover photo, that will just be for the cover in the background of your profile. And then you do have greetings. Your about me is set on your profile. You then also have greetings for the intro to a lobby or matchmaking, and the same post race as well. This is what it will display when you enter an actual lobby itself, or when you're just about to leave and the race is done. You then have social links, nickname, which of course is your name in game. This can be changed a few amount of times, I believe like twice or something. And then of course finally you have about the game, which is just credits and such for developers. Okay, so the next bunch of settings you will find is in the settings tab once you actually enter an event itself. So we're going to head over to settings now, and the first one we're going to take a look at is assist settings. Now these are going to be my assist regardless of whether I'm on wheel or of course controller. As you can see for my transmission, I have this set at manual. Again, I will fully recommend manual transmission over automatic any day. The automatic transmission inside of Gran Turismo 7 is absolutely horrific and will lose you a ton of time. Next up is traction control. Again, I run this at absolute zero, so completely off. The main reason is I do find this to be the worst assist in game for completely bogging cars down. And again, it's even worse when it comes to kind of skiddy road cars. You find that you will lose a ton of time even having this remotely on. Next up is of course going to be ABS. I do hear some people run this at weak, and in fact, prior to the physics change in July of last year, I was one of those. Again, regardless of being on controller or wheel, I would always run my ABS at weak. However, once the kind of physics of the game changed, I just haven't been able to adjust properly to having it on weak once again, so I always have this set to default. Never have it fully off, it's an absolute nightmare, so default is definitely the way to go. Auto drive, I believe this is the game automatically driving for you. You can choose from brake and steering, brake or off. I fully recommend once again just having this off. Next up is driving line assistance. I have this entirely off, but it can be useful if you're at a track you're not very confident with. So of course we have multiple options here. You have corner indicators, driving line and all. Selecting all will turn them both on. Selecting the one or the other will set that specific one on. So driving line is just a line that you follow, of course. I think everybody knows that. Corner indicators are little markers at the side of the road which will tell you where you need to be for each corner. Then we have braking indicator. This will just flash up on your HUD telling you when to actually brake. Again, it's rather quite messy and just gets in the way, so I have this off. Same with braking area. This will give you a big red area that is set on the floor telling you exactly where you need to brake. I do find that it is massively off exactly where the braking point is, so most of the time it's completely irrelevant. Replace car after leaving track, I just have this off, but again, I don't think it makes much of a change. I'm not exactly sure what this setting does. I do find that if you go off the track anyway, it's just going to put your car back. And then next is ASM, or active stability management. This can be a useful assist for very specific time trials, or if a car's set up in a specific way. Most of the time, kind of 99% of the time, I'll run this off. But again, there is the odd occasion where it can be useful. The one that I do find can be incredibly useful though is counter steering assistance. Most of the time I will have this off. However, a little bit like ASM, there is the odd occasion where having it set to weak is incredibly useful. And again, it's not too intrusive that it will completely take over your game, where something like traction control will entirely bog a car down. Counter steering assistance set to weak just kind of runs in the background and actually does a lot of work in making the car faster, but it's very, very dependent on the actual car itself. So the main two there is ASM and counter steering assistance. So it is completely up to you if you want to run them. I do find that counter steering is definitely the best of the bunch. If you set it to weak, I would never recommend having it on strong, and same with ASM, very, very car dependent there. So next up, we're going to head back into controller settings, and things are going to look a little bit different in this menu. The main one we're going to take a look at here is going to be controller steering sensitivity. I have this set at 10 for pretty much every single car inside of Gran Turismo 7. I believe by default it's something like 0. You can have it all the way down to -2, which is incredibly slow, but I fully recommend having it at 10. Overall, it feels fantastic with pretty much every car. There is the odd occasion where you might have to go down a couple of notches to about maybe 8, sometimes 9, but never below that. Most of the time you'll have it set at 10, and then of course just leave it there. Again, it makes the car's steering and sensitivity much more responsive and overall much quicker. Of course, again, I am running a medium length stick extender when I run a controller, so for me it's incredibly quick direction changes and overall feels fantastic. And it's the exact same on a standard control stick as well. Even if you don't have an extender on, I fully recommend running a controller steering sensitivity of 10. Now, the other thing that is in here when it comes to my T598, whilst I'm not doing specific settings, my force feedback is going to be a max torque of 3 and a feedback sensitivity of 1. So that is going to be it for my in-game settings for the wheel. Next up is display settings. Once again, this is going to be a bit different when you do it in game. So we have race info display. I have this as display all. Again, you can customize it. This is going to be what it's going to show you in game. We then have driver list. Now you can either display the car names or the driver names. For me personally, I prefer to know what cars I'm up against rather than the actual driver name on screen, so I can just check the leaderboard, see what cars are in the event, and of course just take it from there. So for me personally, driver list display is going to be set to cars. Car name display, this is going to be as you go past them. So again, you can display driver names or the car, or have it entirely off. It can get a little bit messy at times, so if you want it less cluttered, just set it to off. If you want the cars, then of course set it to cars. Next up is going to be driver display name. This is going to be online, whether you want it to display nicknames or of course the actual PSN. And then we have display ghost. I have this set to off because I find that a ghost is incredibly distracting when I'm doing circuit experiences or time trials. So for me, I'll have it off for the majority of the time. Again, I don't really want to be racing my current fastest lap. We of course then have display settings, which I've kind of taken you through, and that's all just going to help you kind of set up the image for your specific monitor or TV and such. So again, not much different to talk about there. So the final few settings I want to show you is when you're actually in the race itself. So what you're going to do here is of course go to the pause menu, head over to the settings from here and go down to display settings. This will unlock these two at the bottom, which is view, where you can adjust cockpit view or adjust your chase cam. Now here on my settings, of course, as you can see, the first one is going to be the actual height of your in-car view. This is the one we're going to focus on first. I have mine set at 0. If you want it higher, go for 5. If you want it lower, -5. It's the exact same when it comes to your view. I personally have mine out as far as possible at 5. If you want it closer, it's -5. If you want it in the middle to default, it's going to be 0. But for me, I have my depth at 5. Now the next one is orientation. You can of course have default or offset. I don't know anybody that actually runs the offset, so we're going to leave that at default. And then we have the wobble type. You have a type 1 and a type 2. So I have mine set to type 1, and this is what it looks like when we're going around corners and such. It's kind of moving slightly and wobbling, but again, it's still very, very stable and not too distracting. However, if we set it to wobble type 2 and of course back out, as you can see, it's much more aggressive and wobbly in how it's moving, and I would say overall just far too distracting. I feel like this one moves far too much, and again, I've just never been able to gel with that. So for me, type 1 for the wobble effect, type 2 is just absolute overkill. Of course, the other camera is the chase camera. Now, when it comes to the camera sensitivity, I have it set at 1. When it comes to the rotation center offset, I have it set at 1, and the view type is near. Now, for me personally, at 1, it's absolutely perfect. It gives you just enough movement. It doesn't completely stick the camera to the back of the car the entire time, so you kind of get this more kind of natural movement feeling, especially when you're kind of drifting or throwing it into a corner really, really aggressively. For me, that first setting at 1 is an absolute must. However, if I show you what it looks like at 10, you're going to see just how stuck to the back of the car this is. And for me, I believe that is the kind of, sort of default camera for Gran Turismo 7, with how the camera actually sticks right to the back of the car no matter what you do. Anyway, heading back to display, we're going to head back to the camera to set that back to 1, and of course to show you once again exactly the different movement that we're seeing here. Now the next next setting is going to be the offset. Now I'm not exactly sure what this does. I've just left it at 1 for many years and then just kind of, left it there. If you put it at 3, I can't really tell much of a difference what is kind of going off here. Supposedly there's an offset somewhere, but I'm not exactly seeing it. And in fact, I never really noticed much of a change. So even at the maximum there's not too much going on in terms of difference. And if we put it at 0 again, there's not too much of a difference. So maybe I'm just not seeing it here, but I've never fully understood this one, hence why I just leave it at 1. So of course view type is going to be if you want the near camera or the far camera. I believe by default in Gran Turismo 7 it's actually set to far, which I just really don't like. I think it makes the car look way too small in terms of the actual picture and such. So for me this is an absolute no-no. I really do not like the far camera inside of Gran Turismo 7. So of course if you head back to display settings you can go ahead and change it to near. Really it can be car dependent. Some of the hatchbacks I would say do actually look better on the far camera, but that's incredibly rare. Most of the cars just look better on the near, and as you can see here when we look around and such, again it just looks much more clean, gives you a better look at the car, especially if you've got a custom car. I would say just run it at near, and in fact really for anything just run the near camera. Anyway, with that is my full settings guide for Gran Turismo 7. Hopefully this helped learn you what each and every single setting does and what my personal preferences are. And of course, hopefully it just makes your game that little bit much better. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one. Take care guys. Peace.